Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming tonight. This is not something I do a lot, so bear with me. Are any of the folks here tonight, do you have an interest in archaeology or no? Okay, so if I steer you wrong, you'll call me out on it. Huh? Okay. What we're going to talk about tonight is the prehistory of Orange County. And prehistory is a kind of a tricky thing because the people aren't here to tell us what they thought, what they did, when they did it. We have to go with what we call the material evidence. And what we find is little bits of chipped stone, maybe some pottery, ceremonial items. And if an archaeologist finds something and he doesn't know what it is, it must be ceremonial. And from that, we make a determination of how these people lived. And very often, 2, 3 archaeologists will give you 3 different interpretations. So it's a fun discipline. When you study it, well, I found anyway, and I studied it fairly recently. That was a midlife crisis kind of thing to go out and get a college degree. I found that if you could make a good argument for something, nobody could tell you it was wrong. So I'm here tonight to make some good arguments. We are going to look at the last. Now this says goes back 13,000 years. We're pushing it back now to at least 15,000 and probably earlier. And this is rather small, I know, and it's really just a summary of what we'll be seeing tonight. The early Holocene from 1,1200 years ago to about 13,000 years ago to 8,000, and then the middle Holocene up to 3,000 years ago, and then the late Holocene, which we're still in now, and when a lot of things happened that we know more about. But we're going to go back to the early. And again, there were no political boundaries in those days. So I can't tell you this is Placentia history or even Orange County history. I can tell you that this is what happened on the California coast 13,000 years ago and earlier. Okay, here we go. The Clovis culture has gotten a lot of play over the years. When I first started studying archaeology 20 years ago, Clovis was the baseline. That was what we knew about early man in North America, in all of the Americas. And it was determined that these people came across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia. Now, at that time, again, this was during the Ice Age. A lot of the Earth's water was tied up in ice flows and glaciers, and the sea level was at least 300 feet lower than it is now. So these people were able to walk from Asia to Alaska. And then, under this theory, they populated the Americas. Well, it's a long way from the Bering Strait to the tip of South America. And yet all these settlements were popping up dated to 12,000 years ago. And we know those people didn't cross over there and run like heck to South America. It doesn't work that way. So it was a puzzle that, now we we're saying that wasn't exactly how it happened. The Clovis people were identified in New Mexico, at Clovis, New Mexico, and it was what we call a bison kill site. They found a lot of bison bones, and they found these spear points, these fluted spear points, embedded in and in association with these bison bones. And that was where the Clovis culture was named. But these points were showing up all through the Americas at that time. And these people, or this technology, around 12,000 years ago, it disappeared. Coincidentally, at about the same time as the megafauna of the period, the bison and all those prehistoric animals, about 12,000 years ago, they all went away. And whether it was climatic change as the glaciers melted, there was a thought that they were killed off by our Clovis people, but it would take an awful lot of people with spears to eliminate bison herds. So, for whatever reason, and there are theories involving meteors and such, that as to why the Clovis culture just seemed to fade out. And once we got beyond that, let's not get beyond it yet. Okay. Oh, that way. All right. This is the base of a spear here, and this would be possibly Clovis. We found this out in the California desert, and nobody has said for sure that this is a Clovis point, but looking at that, it's almost 3 centimeters wide and probably would have been 7 or 8 long, and that's what they were hunting with at the time. And this is what they were hunting. That is a mammoth tusk. And I mean, would you want to go up against something like that with a pointy stone on the end of a stick? But that was what we know of the Clovis culture. All right. So just recently, there's a new theory. And we're not saying that there wasn't a migration around 12,000, but we're saying there was an earlier migration. And we refer to this as the coastal migration, and that they were using the kelp highway. And what we mean is that, again, water levels were so much lower at the time, but the landscape from Alaska all the way down through California was very similar offshore. There was kelp, and kelp is the home of all kinds of marine animals, seashells. Some seaweeds can be eaten. These people could have traveled, and likely did travel, down the coast. May or may not have had boats, but it's quite possible. And they didn't need to adapt. There weren't great climatic changes. It's not like if you go from Alaska to the Southwest desert. There's not a great change. Things were very similar all the way. And those sites that would be there now to tell us where these people traveled and what their resources were are quite possibly lost under 300 feet of water now. And that's the next step for here in Southern California, and particularly the people researching on the Channel Islands. They know what's on the islands now, but they don't know what was there 12,000 years ago because it's under 300 feet of water. So that's what we're looking for. And this is why we say, yes, Clovis is a valid culture, but it's not necessarily the first one. The people that we're seeing on the coast used different technology. They were maybe seafaring people. And there is also discussion as to whether there were Polynesian migrations across the Pacific. And we're not ruling that out because Australia was populated 50,000 years ago, and those people had to cross a very deep ocean from southern Asia, and somehow they did it. They had boats or rafts and were capable of crossing large bodies of water. Now, the Pacific is a whole lot larger than that. But again, if they island hopped, some people feel there is a cause to say, okay, maybe they finished up in South America. And after 13 or 14,000 years, it's really hard to say one way or the other. But we do know that sites on the Channel Islands are dated as old as 14,000 years. And the current landmass of the northern Channel Islands off the Ventura coast and Santa Barbara, which was one single island back at this time, is now 4 separate islands, and is only 24% of the land mass that there would have been during this period. And the sites on that remaining land mass are dated to 14,000 years. So, but what did these people do or live on there? They lived on shellfish, shallow water marine animals, maybe sea otters, that kind of thing. Water birds. We have a cause for evidence of hunting birds, seaweed, and some grains from the vegetation on the islands. On the mainland, rabbits were likely hunted, small animals. They were depending more on nets and snares rather than any kind of projectile. And the people here, they didn't build the kind of architecture we see in the Southwest. There was no cliff dwellings or huge pueblos that we see, well, more recently in the Southwest, and not this far back. But they were, if they had any kind of shelter, it was usually a pit house, it was a depression in the ground, maybe some poles supporting a thatched roof. And those don't survive very well. When we find those, it's because the color of the post hole, where the post was, the color of the post hole is different to the surrounding soil. So we find a circle of round, darker areas of soil and figure there was a pit house there. And they occupied caves and rock shelters, if they had them. Now around here, where are the rock shelters? They're up in the foothills, Weir Canyon and up that way. And most of what we know about them comes from what we call middens. And middens are trash heaps. People, if they had a more or less permanent habitation site, their trash went out to the edge of the village. And what we find in a lot of cases on the California coast are shellfish or shells. And we can tell from those, I mean, some of these things are deep. They're meters thick, where people lived for an extended period of time, but we can tell what kind of shellfish they ate. Was it mussels? Was it abalone? We find bird bones in there perhaps, fish bones, or maybe broken tools. But based on that, we can tell partly how long they were there and partly what they ate and when they ate it. There's technology now that can tell us when these things were harvested, when a particular kind of shellfish was available, and then we know, okay, this settlement was only occupied in the summer or the winter. And that is something, you know, we can't go back and ask them, hey, what time of the year did you live here? But from the trash, we can tell. Trash is what archaeologists love trash. And once again, the megafauna, the mammoth and such, we don't see really any evidence of that here in Southern California, except perhaps for the La Brea tar pits. And you know, that's where they got stuck. And there was human interaction as well there, but otherwise we don't see a lot of that. There is some evidence for pygmy mammoth on the Channel Islands, but I haven't heard a great deal about that. But so come the end of the early Holocene, this is where we were at. Whoop. Okay. You said don't press it too hard. The Middle Holocene, from 3,000 to 8,000 years ago, we also refer to as the Milling Stone period. I've worked on an excavation where we've got down a few inches and the ground is just thick with broken, what we refer to as milling stones, but metates, manos, the kind of grinding tools that are used in Mexican households today or in the Southwest still for grinding corn and other kinds of seeds. And these things, the people seem to depend very much on vegetable resources, grasses, grains, and the like. There is some evidence for them, again, still eating rabbit, because some of our researchers have found rabbit protein on these stones. But that was what was going on, and late in the period, acorns also became a staple. But where are we going? Okay, this is an example of what we'd call a bedrock mortar. In an area where there was a lot of resources, maybe acorns in this case, because it is a mortar, they would drill out these holes, and then with a pestle they would grind the grain or whatever else they caught in these. And of course, when you find something like this, it wasn't something they could carry around, so this was near something that they went back to and used very often.
How did they make the holes? With a harder rock?
Just chip it out, grind it out, yes. And at that time, we get the sense that these people were in small mobile groups and with a heavy reliance on plant resources, and they used these to process. This is how we find the portable ones. Some of these may have been bowls, but these kind of broken rocks with a grinding, some kind of beveled grinding surface on them tells us that has been modified by humans, and we'll find whole areas of those. And then, also around that time, and this is something that is much more local, the cold stones. Now, everybody you speak to will give you a different interpretation of these. These were found in the Santa Ana River drainage. and appear to be localized to the Bolsa Chica area. Researchers there have found caches of them in the ground with an overturned metate or a slab over the top of them. And they are not uniform. They're different. The number of cogs are different. The shapes, the little jelly pan one over here. And they have no known use. So we are back to the ceremonial. And they don't show use wear. This is also something we look for. If these had been used for anything, there'd be a different wear on the outside. These things are pristine, and there's a lot of them. And there have been so many interpretations. One very renowned archaeologist here in town looked at them and said, "Oh, that was probably a prayer for water because it looks like a cross-section of a cactus." Well, maybe, except that I don't think those kind of cactus are native to California. So it's one of those mysteries, but it is also something that is, excites us because this is the only place we find them. So local archaeologists really have something here. And the dates on those are associated dates, and again, archaeological dates in a lot of cases like this are relative. We can't date these specifically, C14, whatever, radiocarbon. It doesn't work on rock. There has to be organic material, carbon involved. So all we can do is look at where they were found and look for maybe evidence of an old campfire, burned grain, something that we can date. And then if these are in association with that, then we can come up with a date. And based on that, we've come up with 7,000 to 7,400 years ago. And this is why, to us, context is a word that is so important to us, because if somebody picks one of those up and takes it away and then takes it to an archaeologist and says, "What is it and how old is it?" we can't tell. We can only tell if they're found in the site and in the original context, below the plow zone. So there are some others. Similar ones have been found on the coast of Chile, going back to 9,500 years, but they're not identical to these. There is a difference in the style of them. And then these. Now, you perhaps can't tell from that, but the largest one of these is about 12 inches long and 4 inches wide. These were found in a site down in Irvine. What we call, that's the site designation at the top, what we call the trinomial, stands for California, Orange County, Site 64. This was the 64th site identified in Orange County. And these, again, we call them ceremonial, and they have no obvious use. There's no use wear on them for a start, but who would use a 12-inch blade? These are very special. They're unique in this area. One of them is obsidian, volcanic glass, and we can source glass. We can source obsidian, and this obsidian is sourced to northeastern California, southern Oregon. So there, the human element comes in. They were traded. Somehow, those found their way from Northern California to Irvine. So there were trade routes. And those are dated to about the same period as the Bolsa Chica sites. So 7,000 years ago, people were walking up and down the American West, or at least passing things on. That's something we see, is that the one person didn't necessarily have to go the whole distance, but they could pass on the material or the knowledge. And maybe that was how the Clovis culture got spread around. People didn't move all the way through the Americas, but somebody in the next village looked at what this guy was doing and said, "Oh, that's a really good idea, I'll try that." And then the next village down took a look at it, and the technology can travel rather than the people. And we also know that, not necessarily during this period, but we know there was trade between California and at least as far east as New Mexico. And we see a lot of shell beads back there, and there are no shellfish in New Mexico. And then, towards the end of the Middle Holocene, about 5,000 years ago, acorns became a much more staple resource. And this is up in Weir Canyon. And again, the mortar holes in the rock, and probably used for processing acorns. And again, to process acorns, I mean, yes, you pound them and you get the acorn flour, but you can't eat that right away. There's so much tannin in it. It has to be leached out. So what they were using was baskets, finely woven baskets, that they would put this in, and then they'd put it in a stream or put it in water and leach out that tannin before they could use it. And at this period, there was no pottery in this area. Everything was either baskets or rock. And the basketry we see was what we have seen is the asphaltum, the oil globs that we complain about on the beaches here from natural seeps off the coast. They could use that to melt and line the inside of a basket so that it would hold water. And we see those. And then, where are we at? Oh, and also about that time there was a migration, what we call the Shoshonean Wedge. It was like there was a language group moved in from the north of east and came into the California coast and split the population. Now, we can't say if there was warfare, and we see no evidence of it, but there was just this change in the culture of the people coming in from further inland. And then okay, and this also is up there in Weir Canyon, around where those mortars are. And these are petroglyphs. These are carvings in the rock that is something, again, that we can't interpret. We go out and we look at rock art, either petroglyphs or pictographs, and we have no way of knowing just what these people were saying with these. Well, maybe some people will say, well, they're fertility symbols or something like that. More recent ones, perhaps, because the more recent peoples would have been able to tell us about their rituals and what certain symbols meant, but not these. And that's another fun mystery. Okay, 3,000 years to the present, we started to see a lot of trade between the mainland and the Channel Islands. Up until then, there hadn't been a great deal. But we were seeing trade off the Santa Barbara coast. They were using plank canoes up there. And down, closer down this way, Thule rafts. But there was something of an ocean-going tradition at that time. And we're seeing now more projectile points, indicating that they were hunting perhaps larger animals. And the introduction of the bow and arrow, and that wasn't until about 1700 years ago. About 300 AD, the bow and arrow reached California. We see it in the Arctic about 5,000 years, but that was another technology that took a while to travel south, and even later into the southwest. So at that point, they were able to hunt with bow and arrow rather than the atlatl, which is the throwing spear. And around that time, we also saw pottery. And I wonder if that wasn't the influence from Mesoamerica, because there was pottery in the Southwest is beautiful. The Californian people never really picked up on that. Their pottery was quite rough, utilitarian. There wasn't a great deal of decoration like you see on the black and white Anasazi pottery, which is my love. So by that time, introduction of pottery, then we had 500 years ago, the Spanish claimed California, and everything changed. But not right away. They did some exploration and kind of drifted away, and not too many of the local people came in contact with them until 1769, when they built the first mission in San Diego, and then everything changed. I say, like other colonists around the world, their aim was to civilize and Christianize the local population. And to some extent that was successful, and it meant that cultural traditions were lost. Language was lost. And it's only now that the local people are saying, hey, we have a tradition back there and we need to find it again, and start teaching those that still know the language, starting to pass it on and pass on their traditions. But also, when the early ethnographers approached the local peoples that still had the knowledge, they didn't always get the full story. The local native people were very reluctant to talk about their traditions and their ritual. It wasn't something you went out and described to a stranger. And sometimes what they told us wasn't even right. So they're working on recreating their history, and maybe that will give us more idea of what was happening. During the mission period, this was taken down at San Juan Capistrano Mission, and in that alcove, that symbol is very native. That is the kind of thing we'd see on rocks out on the hillside. And I don't know whether that was plastered over at one point or not, or whether that was part of the visible construction at the beginning. But, okay, one more. This here, you don't see it very clearly, but that is a horse and rider. That is a native painting, and that was plastered over. Somewhere during the construction period, somebody that had been indentured almost to work on the mission. He painted that on the wall, and then they plastered over it. And it's only just recently, as that plaster has worn off, things like this have come into view again. And it was, oh yeah, he wasn't letting them take his culture away completely. He was building it into this. And I've seen that Pecos Mission in New Mexico. They have a mission church there. They have a wall that's embedded with symbolic items. Again, seashells. You know, this is northeastern New Mexico. But there are seashells embedded into the adobe in this church wall, and other items. And that was a way of saying, you know, you may be teaching us your religion, but we're still incorporating ours into it. So this is something like that. And this is an actual pictograph. That's up the Ortega Highway on a rock. And it's typical of the kind of artwork we see in this area. Red ochre paint, and it's a diamond chain, and that is a symbol we see quite a bit out there. And again, you have to know where to look for it. And we know.
Now what's the hand holding over there?
I don't know. I think he's just probably pointing something out. Now, I maybe cropped that out of a larger picture just to try and get a close-up of the rock art. I wish I knew D-Stretch, because there is a program now called D-Stretch. And for pictographs, you run it through and it enhances the image to the point where we're finding things we never knew existed. I mean, we'll say, oh yes, we know what this panel represents. And we'll de-stretch it, and it's like there's all kinds of other things there that we hadn't seen. Or something that's been graffitied over, and we can enhance it to see what was there before some idiot put his initials on it. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
And then this is contemporary basketry. This was a display down at San Juan Capistrano, but this was, I mean, typical of the work that the native folks were doing, that they're carrying on the tradition now. And this is at the Blas Aguilar Cultural Museum down there. That's a granary. That's up off the ground on a pedestal, and they could have stored acorns or something in that. And, oh right. I had no idea how long this would take. And pretty much that brings us up to the present. So I need to give you the obligatory sunset that's used to end every archaeological presentation. I think that's in New Mexico. I think that's New Mexico. I think that's the Coronado Park out of Albuquerque, but it's a sunset. That's one of my better ones. And there we go. Thank you. And yes.
You mentioned how the people had changed or something to that effect way back several thousand years ago. What did you mean by that? And the difference of people coming into the...
Oh, that there was the migration from the east. The languages, apart from the material culture, the artifacts they left, the languages changed. The Chumash people up around Santa Barbara, they are probably the oldest language group. They maintained that. The people further south speak a different dialect, but there was like a wedge of people that existed to the present, almost, I mean, to the prehistoric present, that we're a different language group associated with people from the East. So it's considered that there was a movement of people out to the coast.
Was it good or bad or?
Well, they say we have no evidence that they fought. We don't have signs of battles or anything like that.
And they didn't speak English like we do, but they had their own language.
Right, yes. I mean, Native people across the country have so many different languages, and that was one of them.
It's interesting, yeah.
Did you do the diggings at Channel Islands?
I haven't been out there, no. And
Oh, okay.
Any-
Because PBS had a series
Mhm.
on the Channel Islands. It was really good.
Yeah.
And it talked
Yes.
about the diggings.
There's so much work going on out there.
St. Nicholas Island?
We have presentations all the time of people that are working out there and what they're finding.
Yeah, they did a history on, Catalina,
Mm-hmm.
and then the one they had the cattle ranch, is
Mhm.
one of the islands.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. They had 3 or 4
Yeah.
different.
I've done very little excavation or field work, and what I have is like things like Earthwatch, where you pay to go and do some researcher's work for him. And I have it excavated in Arizona, the Homolivy Pueblo, and up in,
Flagstaff,
pardon?
Flagstaff, Grand Canyon.
Well, it's beyond Flagstaff. It's across the highway from Winslow. And also southern Colorado, out of Cortez.
Oh, yeah.
And down the Ortega Highway, there was a field class.
Yeah, what's that? The dwellings, it's out of Cortez. Cliff dwellings.
Oh, in Mesa Verde.
Mesa Verde.
Yes, yes. But that's, like I say, my interest now, I mean, I've gotten too old to do excavation, and we don't do as much of that anymore. My interest now is like this cultural preservation and public outreach and trying to get people to appreciate what we had and not pave it over
Or knock it down?
and knock it down. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
oh yeah,
They've done a lot of that.
yeah. Recently,
But they wrote a book about that Indian. It was called The Lone Indian on that island.
Oh yes, the lone woman of St. Nicholas. Yeah. Yes. Well, that's it was the Island with the Blue Dolphins,
Yeah.
which I just read a year or two back after we had a presentation talking about what happened to the lost woman when they brought her back to the mainland and she got pneumonia and died.
Like at the Heritage Park in Santa Fe Springs, they have Oliveras had a house there, but they knocked it down.
Mm-hmm.
But they also, it's a place where they used to throw their trash
Mhm.
over there.
They knocked that house down?
Oliveras house in Santa Fe Springs?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. All there is just a plaque.
Oh,
Mm.
sickening.
Okay. And, well,
Are there
Oh.
any more questions?
Yeah.
What's the trash you called again?
a midden,
Midden.
M-I-D-D-E-N. Mm-hmm.
Are they gonna do any, or is there a way to do any, excavation 300 feet below
The ocean.
in the ocean?
What they're looking at now, I was just hearing about recently, they will do remote sensing, and we're doing a lot more of that on the ground now as well, but that's using ground penetrating radar and different kinds of sensing to determine if there's anything under the soil that looks different, an anomaly. And then once they find that, that's kind of where we excavate now. We don't go in with a bulldozer and dig a trench through a mound anymore like they used to. We pick our areas very selectively because 100 years from now we'll have different technology and you don't want to spoil too much. But they will use the ground penetrating radar or the remote sensing, and then if they find something that looks significant, they will bore a core, a stratigraphic core out of it. And that will show them if there's any midden material or anything in that area. And that's our next step off the Channel Islands. And
Question about the cogstones
Mhm.
at Bolsa Chica.
mhm.
Has Pacific Coast Archaeological Society had any influence on what happened to the cogstones in that area to thwart the Brightwater development?
One of our members is the principal researcher on that project they've been doing out there. So we think we've saved at least that area, because yes, that was.
Do you work with the Land Trust? The Bolsa Chica Land Trust?
We as a society we don't, but you know, individual members. We as a society we try not to get politically involved. But like I say, we have members of all. We used to be just an avocational society 50 years ago when we could volunteer to go dig on a site. But now we have a lot more members who are academics and the people, the CRM companies, cultural resource management companies, who actually do the excavation or the field work now. And we have a lot of those as members, so well, we have a certain influence in that respect. Yes?
You speak of, the people coming across Bering Strait and down, but the migration from Clovis, New Mexico. Were there any other migrations that came from farther south, out of Tucson or Mexico?
Well, that culture spread all the way to South America, to the tip of South America. But how they got there, we can't, whether they went there or whether there were people that came in from other areas that they just passed on the technology. We just know that was the one site where they were first identified, but that technology was all over the Americas at that time.
Was there something from somebody came across on one of the reed boats from Egypt and to show that they could have come?
Thor Heyerdahl did a lot of those, yes. But there is also some thought that people came from Europe across by way of Greenland and Iceland and onto the Atlantic coast. And every time somebody comes up with that kind of a theory and they get laughed out of town, and a few years later we find out they were right. Yeah.
Just Google the human family tree,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks about 6,000 generations back, everybody goes to Africa.
Uh-huh.
They branch out over here. That shows the generation. Pretty neat.
I just wondered, is there any explanation about the extreme change in the water level overall?
Well, that was the melting of the glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. A lot of land mass was covered by great ice sheets during that time. That was the last time the climate got particularly cold. And as it warmed up and those melted, they melted back into the ocean. And that may or may not be what we're looking at now. Whether it will get colder or warmer, we don't know. But climate change isn't anything new.
Well, thank you, Megan. We appreciate it.
Thank you.